March 8, 1986, Frank Williams, the owner of a Formula One team behind the wheel of his car, is rushing to the airport to catch a flight. But suddenly, he hits a road bump. The car flies into the air.
Really whack in my neck, sharp pain.
Seeing all the injuries on Frank's body, the doctors agreed that his future would look grim. But little did they know that their diagnosis would change F1 forever. Fast forward a decade later, Frank, who is paralyzed from head to toe, watches his team become world champions for the 9th time. At the moment, it was an absolute record. But how the heck did he manage to do that? The story begins in 1942, in the small town of South Shields. It was here that Owens Williams and his wife welcomed a son, Frank Williams, during active hostilities. Frank's father was an officer in the Royal Air Force, and his mother worked as a schoolteacher. His father left the family immediately after Frank's birth. Frank lost in the lottery of early life, born into a very poor household. His mother had no choice but to send him to a Catholic boarding school. Frank grew up without any real family. He was raised by the monks. Frank was constantly trying to run away from the boarding school. It may seem that he was trying to escape from the strict regime, but the real reason was much deeper. Every time the boy went to the train station, he'd spend hours watching the trains and admiring the driver's skills. Once, I took him on a bus. He couldn't have been more than 5 years old, and he just sat there staring at the bus driver as though he was looking at a ghost, his mouth open. When I asked him what the matter was, he looked at me and said, as though he was watching a miracle, "That man can drive this big bus, Mum." Frank loved the car so much that he could recite the technical characteristics of almost every road car. Every day, his desire to spend time behind the wheel only grew. His passion was fueled by the sight of luxury cars when his parents picked up their children from school. Frank imagined himself driving each of these cars. Sometimes he even got lucky.
I love trains and movement. I was always trying to get a ride in a car. When someone's dad turned up with the cars all over the car, and sometimes they gave me a ride up and down the road. I was nuts about cars by then.
The 13 years of orphanage left Frank craving freedom. That's why he never went to university. All he was interested in was racing. He dreamed of becoming a great racing driver. But there were two big problems: money and skills. He had neither, so Frank had to start from the bottom. July 2nd, 1961 was a turning point in his life. That day, Frank was on the cover of Motorsport magazine, but instead of fame, he received the dubious honor of being named the worst driver of the day. Due to heavy rain, Frank lost control of his car in a corner and spun. Frank was not alone, as a certain Jonathan crashed in the same place. Maybe the accident was meant to happen. After a while, Jonathan, with the support of his father, bought a Merlin car to participate in Formula Junior. He kindly offered Frank to work for him as a mechanic. Williams got his first job in motorsports. Their lives changed drastically. They were living for the race, competing every weekend from May to September. Only once a week did they allow themselves to stay in a hotel to take a shower, eat a decent meal, and sleep. The rest of the time, they slept with the car in a Volkswagen pickup truck. But everything has an end. Jonathan ran out of money and had to return to England. Now Frank was left not only without money, but also without racing. However, during the time of cooperation, he made many useful contacts in the racing world. The most important was with Charles Crichton Stewart at a racetrack in East Germany. Charles owned an old apartment at 283 Pinner Road, Harrow, in which he rented out rooms. Frank moved in, but he only had enough money to rent a couch. Money was getting tight, and Frank was ready to do everything for money. He bet Frank 10 shillings that he wouldn't go outside naked when the subway train came through the backyard at exactly 11:50. Frank was surprised at the precision, but accepted the challenge. He ran naked through the bushes, frightening passers-by. When he reached the end, Frank thought it was the easiest 10 shillings he had ever run. But when he turned around, he was horrified to see the parishioners coming out of the church. Their service had just finished at 11:50. They were shocked to see a naked man beating his chest because his friends had blocked the door to his apartment. Guess who it was? The same Jonathan who gave Frank his first job and his friend Piers Courage. They were both permanent residents of apartment number 6. Courage came from an aristocratic family of brewers. He studied at Eton but failed in the Cambridge entrance exams, so now his main passion was racing. Piers was a true gentleman, tall, slim, and with a charming smile. All the residents of apartment number 6 were aristocratic rich guys who were fond of racing. This is what united Frank with them. But unlike his friends, he had no inheritance. Therefore, he had to earn money on his own to live his passion. Williams would do anything to earn a few bob. He even organized shows for the local police. Nevertheless, his friends recall that Frank did not stand out from the crowd. His nickname was Wanker Williams, which says a lot about a haphazard existence. However, there was one trait that distinguished Frank: his unquenchable ambition. He wanted to succeed in life, and it had to be in racing. One day, Frank realized that if he found a problem and combined it with his passion, he could create something profitable. But what is it that racers really cared about? In 1965, he noticed something important. At the height of the racing season, the racers had to make their own arrangements for supplies, and all this at a frantic pace, because the races took place all over Europe. Without bank cards, with paperwork, it was chaos. Frank found the perfect opportunity. His ability to speak French, German, and Italian has enabled him to sell spare parts all over Europe and for all the teams. This was the birth of Frank Williams Racing.
The motivation behind the organisers wanting certain drivers was that in France they had to have matchless, they had to have Beltoirs and servos, Gavin starting.
During my trip to the Italian Grand Prix, I found myself unable to finish the movie about Frank. To make matters worse, F1 TV was blocked. I quickly googled how to get around it, and one name jumped out everywhere: NordVPN. And you know what? I simply selected a different country, and there I was, surfing from the US. This let me not only see the replay of Piastri's crazy overtake, but also continue watching the movie, which inspired me to create this video. So, when NordVPN offered me a sponsorship, it was an obvious choice. For you, I've arranged an exclusive offer. You'll get 4 months of NordVPN absolutely free, as well as a 30-day money-back guarantee. If you don't like it, you can easily get all your money back. There's no risk. Geo-blocking is just one of the use cases. NordVPN can be used for a million things. For example, it has built-in threat protection that not only blocks malicious ads, but also prevents phishing, password stealing, and other online threats. For me, this is convenient. With one click, you can feel completely safe on the internet. If you follow my link, nordvpn.com/Formula History, you will not only get all the bonuses, plus 4 extra months on a 2-year plan, but also support our channel. So thank you.
Italy had to have a Ferrari on the grid, and I guess England particularly wanted a BRM.
Now, Frank could not only afford a bed in apartment 6, but also buy and sell race cars. His dream of becoming a racing driver was becoming a reality. In 1966, Williams bought a Brabham to participate in Formula 3. Finally, this season, Frank managed to win the first race in Sweden. In the very next race, he stepped on the podium again. It seemed that the season was a turning point in his career. However, Frank had a serious issue that would get him in real trouble. Williams was fast, but he didn't know his limits. In almost every race, he would spin or end up in an accident. In Portugal, he launched into the fence of a railroad crossing at full speed. Meanwhile, Williams's business was booming. He had to make a difficult choice. Frank decided to focus on sales. Already in 1967, he surprised himself with a net profit of over £160,000. Today, this is equivalent to £3.7 million. Despite the growth of the business, Frank was not satisfied because he was obsessed with one thing: racing. Piers Courage made things even worse because he was living Frank's dream. Piers was consistently winning races in Formula 2. He was so good at it that he received an invitation to Formula 1 for the 1967 season. However, for the whole year, Courage did not finish a single race. In response to his failures, Frank offered him an unexpected solution: to return to Formula 3. After all, he had recently presented his own Brabham car at the motor show. Although it might have seemed like a step backwards for Piers, difficult times called for difficult decisions. He agreed to drive for Frank while still taking part in F1. The first race for them came at Brands Hatch. Piers won it without any problems. It was so enchanting that he broke the Formula 3 lap record. And at the same time, Frank had a revelation that would change him and his F1 career forever.
After 2 or 3 years of racing rather dangerously around the continent, it became apparent that I might have lots of courage, but nothing like enough skill to go with it.
This was the beginning of a legendary relationship between the two friends, who had been dreaming of taking on the racing world since they were in apartment 6. Their rise was meteoric. In their second season, they challenged Formula 2. Piers won one race, but that was just the beginning. When the winter break came, they moved to Australia to compete in the Tasman Series. But there was one problem: they needed a new car with a V8 engine. So Frank bought last year's Brabham Formula 1 car, and Piers performed brilliantly. 3rd place in the Drivers' Championship. Then came the moment that changed everything forever. It was a normal day at the office. Frank is having lunch with his secretary. Everything is normal, and then she asks, "You know, Frank, you could have a Formula 1 car down there. Why don't you do Formula 1? Frank was confused. He just froze. "I'm only asking, Frank. You've got the car, you've got the engine. Why aren't you doing Formula 1?
Piers and I set off in 1969.
That's how the paddock ended up with a team of a single driver in a Brabham car, Piers Courage. There was so little money that the team had only 3 mechanics. But that didn't stop the two friends. They seemed to be made for each other. Frank was developing as a manager, while Piers was constantly growing as a racer, and it didn't go unnoticed. The results in Formula 1 spoke for themselves.
2nd place at Monte Carlo, can you believe that? 2nd place at US Grand Prix, can you believe that? 5th at Silverstone, had a great run.
Piers was not just a driver, he was already becoming a legend. He managed to defeat such racers as champion Jackie Stewart, Jim Clark, and many others. Piers's talent was so obvious that even Ferrari offered him a contract for the 1970 season. But Frank Williams remained his biggest fan.
Well, I kind of adored Piers in many ways, but in those days it was just, Piers is wonderful, this is my mate, and I thought the world of him.
Their friendship and faith in success was so strong that Piers rejected an offer from Ferrari, while Frank made a deal with an investor, businessman Alessandro De Tomaso, who could finance the team while producing his own car. Frank saw the real potential in the innovative Dallara chassis. Everything seemed perfect. Williams provided the engines, and Piers had to turn this package into victories. But the debut in the first race smashed all hopes. The car was difficult to drive, and in the end, simply slow. However, it was improved in the middle of the season, which was especially noticeable at Zandvoort, when Piers qualified 9th. This was progress, as he had never finished in the previous 5 rounds. When the green light came on, Piers gradually pulled away from his rivals. By lap 22, he was in 7th place. Courage continued to race through the fast corners on the backstretch of the track. Suddenly, De Tomaso's car disappeared. Grey smoke revealed the crash. Piers flew off the road, and the car immediately caught fire.
I was in the race, and it was a terrible accident involving us knowing that it was Piers that had the accident because his helmet came off.
Frank refused to believe it.
And I remember I went to the race organizer, a man called John Korschmidt, And I said, John, just tell me, is Piers dead? Are you sure he's dead? And he said, I'm sure. And I said, tell me that again. And he told me, he is dead, Frank. 3 times I said again.
The same friend who closed the door to the apartment when Frank was running naked, the one who supported his crazy idea in Formula 3, the one who gave him hope of winning Formula 1. He died unexpectedly in Williams' own car. Was it a mechanical failure? Was it a good car? Did I just kill my best friend? A lady that was an avid follower of Frank was wondering if he would be able to carry on in F1 after this tragic accident. Soon enough, Williams is in every newspaper headline. The Frank racing team had missed only 1 race. Despite his loss, Frank stayed in the sport in memory of his beloved friend. But once again, destiny would hit hard. Courage's death not only broke Frank, but it also affected Alessandro De Tomaso. The team was not achieving any results, and almost every race ended with a mistake or an accident. This led to the fact that Williams did not have a car for the 1971 season. However, Frank already had a plan to fix it. Right now, he was discussing that plan with a person who truly cared about his future. It was a beautiful girl named Virginia.
Well, she's blonde, blue eyes, beautiful thick head of hair, beautiful manners, beautiful clothes, came from quite a wealthy background.
Their story began when Frank sold the car to her fiancé. Ginny didn't realize it at first, but she seemed to fall in love at first sight. One Christmas morning, her phone rang. The gentleman on the other end introduced himself as Frank Williams. He wanted to arrange a meeting with her husband, but Ginny suddenly held her breath and said, "Would you rather have lunch with me?" Frank agreed without hesitation, and over a cup of orange juice, he shares with her that he has managed to find several sponsors. Despite several podiums this season, the team's results were not satisfying. Frank felt that the problem was the car, and that's when he had a seemingly crazy idea that could be the key to the championship. He signed a brand new deal with Apolitoys that would allow him to build his own car from scratch. Frank could put in all of his knowledge and experience to create the best car of the grid, but it all went wrong. Not only were they late in making the car, but they also built a complete brick. Only after 7 races of the season, the team received the previously ordered cars. But it got even worse. During the first race, one of their cars crashed. The investment was written off in less than half an hour. Everything seemed to collapse in an instant. Frank was left with nothing but debts. The situation was so critical that he was even evicted from his apartment. Meanwhile, Ginny left her husband's house and moved to a new place. She didn't know how to tell Frank about her new place, so she just sent him a note: "Orange juice is now served at this address." But Ginny wanted to be more than that for Frank, so she began taking steps without which the Williams team would not have existed. For Frank's sake, Ginny did something that a lot of people would consider as crazy. Ginny sold her apartment to pay Frank's debt.
You were very hard up when you first got married.
No, I think I did have I had a sort of running allowance, which was, I don't know, £40 a month. Well, it sounds pathetic, but in fact in those days it wasn't that pathetic, because you could certainly feed yourself on a £5 a week to people. And it was insignificant, but it just kept us ticking over.
Frank was only interested in racing, and it seemed like he was even using Ginny. It was easy for him to borrow her car and return it without fuel. Eventually, Frank even sold the car to pay off his debts.
Frank had such a bad reputation with the banks. I mean, bounce checks for sort of 10 years on people. And Frank just, nobody would take a check from Frank. He used to bounce checks on me. I used to say, look, I've got to have some money, he's going to give you 20 quid. He used to bounce it.
Everything changed in 1973. Ginny became pregnant. Although Frank wasn't happy about the news, he realized that she needed his support. Soon, they were choosing together a name for their future baby and dreaming about the life they could give to it. But one day, Ginny suddenly became ill. The pain was so intense that she could barely reach the phone that was disconnected because of their debt. Neighbors took her to the hospital, But unfortunately, in the 4th month of her pregnancy, Ginny lost her baby. They were both devastated. Now they were haunted by problems not only in Formula One, but also in their family life.
Which were the years that someone described as Frank at that time was the all-time least
successful? 72, 73, 74, 75.
At the time, Frank's attempts to build a car became the topic of jokes in the racing community. Williams was described as the least successful designer in history. The drivers who competed for his team even came up with a saying: "One of the fastest ways to ruin your career is to drive for Williams." While it was possible to ignore other people's words, it was much harder to avoid financial problems. Sometimes the mechanics' salaries were delayed for weeks, and the worst was when their wives started putting pressure on them. Frank had to give away all his possessions. If he had no money, he paid with watches and clothes. Things were so bad that by 1975, Frank's debts had reached £140,000, which is equivalent to £1.4 million today. It was the most difficult period for Frank. He would return from races exhausted, completely crushed. For the first time in his life, racing began to scare him. He was worried about the engine blowing up that would add a 4-figure check to his debt. To cope with the difficulties, Frank just ran. He was like Forrest Gump, who ran non-stop. One evening, Frank went for a long run because he had to ponder an offer. He had the opportunity to sell out 60% of the team and close all debts. It was a chance to build a championship car. However, the price was high, the loss of full control and the company name. He had a tough decision to make. When Frank returned home, he called businessman Walter Wolf. "I accept your offer." From that moment on, Frank's life began to change. Now he not only had money, but also a new partner. Walter bought out a team called Hesketh, where James Hunt won his first Grand Prix. Not only did things begin to improve in Formula One, but the family did as well. Virginia became pregnant again. This time, Frank was very happy. He was so impressed that one day he told Ginny,
I think it would be a good idea if we got married. What do I think? And I was thrilled. I couldn't believe it, really. I was almost hopping about with joy.
Now their child was to be born into a real family. The boy was named Jonathan Piers Williams. If you've already guessed why, you know how much friends meant to Frank. Jonathan is in honor of the man who gave him his first job. And his middle name, you already know why. It seemed that money and people would finally solve all Williams' problems in Formula One. But in 1976, it became clear that the team was not working as it should. Walter Wolf, who was no stranger to defeat, began to think of something interesting. One day, Williams came to his team's factory, inserted the key, but the door did not open. A guy appeared in the window and said, "Your things are in the other room. From now on, you are not allowed to visit the factory." Frank was thrown out of his own factory, which he lived for. It was the only thing that really mattered to Frank. But the biggest blow came 6 weeks later. His car, once called Williams, now named Wolf, won its first Grand Prix. It was the result Frank had been working towards for years. What he had started with Piers for, what he had gone into debt for, had become a reality, but without him.
We heard the result. Somebody phoned through the result, and I was devastated. I mean, how is one supposed to feel? And I hated, above all else, seeing the Williams called a Wolf. I hated it.
After that, Frank saw no point in living anymore. He was deeply depressed and just lay in bed, unable to move.
But what I think he is ashamed that he should perhaps think to himself, in this case, there is reason to be depressed, and you've got to go through depression to get out of it.
At this point, something truly magical began to happen. One by one, Frank's friends began to support him, both emotionally and financially. This gave Williams a huge boost of confidence to start from scratch. But why would things be different this time around? He was looking for any opportunity to return to Formula One. It seemed that getting funding from Bellevue was the best option. There was only one problem. He had to find a Belgian driver. As you might have guessed, Frank made a comeback to Formula One in 1977 with funding from Bellevue. However, there was not enough time and money to build his own car. So the team bought a March car and worked on their project at the same time. Frank had an ace up his sleeve for this. Before he accepted Walter's offer, Frank hired a talented engineer named Patrick Head. Williams saw him as a genius, but a very special one. Head did not seek innovation. He was only interested in winning. After 8 years without a victory in Formula One, this is exactly what Frank needed. He invited Patrick to join the new team, and the latter agreed without hesitation.
I met Patrick, which is the best thing, apart from marrying the wife I married, the best thing ever happened to me in my life. He was a gifted engineer.
But there was still a lack of money. Do you remember the guy who made Frank run around naked? Charles Crichton Stewart. He became a pilot of jet planes and made some useful connections. Frank remained friends with him and saw his potential in finding sponsors. It really worked. Thanks to Charles, Arab investors began to finance the team. And for the first time in his life, Frank was able to solve his money problems. Charles, who was on friendly terms with Alan Jones, invited him to visit the factory in 1977. Upon seeing the design of Patrick Head, Alan agreed to drive for Frank. Oh boy, no one could even guess what this alliance would lead to. Williams cars have always been at the back of the peloton, and nothing has changed now. Alan's first and second Grand Prix ended in a crash. In the next race in Africa, he hardly qualified in 18th place. It seemed that Patrick had not managed to solve the problem of the car's stability. But when the race started, out of the blue, Alan began to overtake car after car. By the end of the 5th lap, Alan was already 12th and kept climbing. Alan's speed was so impressive that he finished in 4th place. It seemed that he was similar to Piers. They became even more similar when Alan managed to take 2nd place at the US Grand Prix. Both drivers gave Frank the confidence to win.
We were of a similar age, and I think I very quickly gained a good understanding of what Alan needed from the car.
Unfortunately, this success was short-lived. The car let Alan down again and again. For Frank and Patrick, this became a new challenge. They knew that Alan had the potential to become a champion, but he needed a really good car to do so. At that time, British teams began to introduce the ground effect, which was revolutionary in racing. The Lotus team was the first to apply this innovation and win a championship in 1978. Williams wasted no time in adapting the successful design for the 1979 season. At that time, a second driver, Clay Regazzoni, joined the team. But both drivers found the new car difficult to drive. Alan said he felt like he was on rails. In response, the team made a decision that became a turning point. It was damn simple, but incredibly effective. Build a wind tunnel to test the car. During these tests, they discovered that the airflow around the engine needed to be improved. The changes were implemented during the British Grand Prix. As soon as the car hit the track, a quiet revolution began.
When qualifying came on Friday afternoon, everybody was running around doing, I think, a high 13 or something was the time. Alan went round on his first time lap. I do remember the time, it was an 11:88. So he jumped literally 2 seconds.
And the rest of the pit lane were doing mid-13s. And it was most peculiar because you were standing there with your thing and everybody went and looked down at us. They just could not believe it.
At the time, Clay Regazzoni took 4th place.
Punching through, it's Clay Regazzoni taking the lead. That's incredible. It's the two Saudia Williams cars first into Copse Corner.
For a moment, Regazzoni took the lead, but Alan was damn fast. He made a brilliant maneuver to overtake 2 cars and take the lead.
And it is still Alan Jones leads now.
Everyone in the team worked so hard that they really deserved this victory.
And that is trouble for Alan Jones. And it's the way he's coasting, it looks as though he's burst his engine.
But on the 39th lap, smoke came out from under Alan's car. It was a real blow. Fortunately, Clay took the lead. Frank was counting every lap to the finish. 5 laps to go. Regazzoni was in the lead. 3 laps to go.
Clay Regazzoni almost home to win the first race ever for the Saudi Williams team.
1 lap.
And Clay Regazzoni goes across the line and he has won the British Grand Prix.
For the first time in 10 years in Formula One, Frank Williams took his first victory.
Frank Williams, this must be the happiest day of your motor racing life.
No doubt about it. You're right, yes.
Frank, what were your feelings during those last few laps?
Well, sheer terror that the car wouldn't finish. We'd lost out and I was terrified of losing Clay, but the car was very sweet.
This was the beginning of a golden era for Williams. Alan won the next 3 races. Even then, he still beat the little genius Gilles Villeneuve at his home Grand Prix in Canada. The Williams team completely dominated at the end of the season. They won 5 times and took 2nd place in the Constructors' Championship. Everyone realized that the next season could be a turning point for this small team, as they may become real contenders for the title. Frank and Patrick knew that they needed to improve on what was already working. They managed this task perfectly.
Jones has done it and he is the world champion.
You got the one for the World Championship. This is a good confirmation. Congratulations to you.
Finally, Frank's dream came true. His team won the first title. Frank was living his dream. Recently, he was considered the biggest loser in Formula One. But now, everyone knows Frank would never give up, and that was just the beginning. The 1981 season was a smooth sailing for Williams. They dominated and claimed another constructor title, even with their new driver Carlos Reutemann that replaced Clay. But then, Frank was not satisfied, because the championship title slipped from his fingers by 1 point. Frank was setting his eyes on the next season, hoping to get both titles. But things took a sudden turn when Alan decided to leave the team and enjoy his retirement. Keke Rosberg, who was a driver for the former team of Frank, had no seat because the Wolf's team quit F1. And Frank saw in that an opportunity to get a great driver. And he was right in his call, although things may have ended differently because the F1 sport was going through a major crisis following the death of Gilles Villeneuve. That season was truly chaotic. If you want me to cover it in another video, feel free to leave a comment. But in the midst of all this chaos, Frank got the title he was aiming for.
He's the world champion of 1982, Keke Rosberg.
And he entered the history book by having a driver winning the champion title with only 1 victory. Frank's life changed overnight after 10 years of hard work, became an F1 star. But Williams wanted his team to make history. He realized that winning while dominating is a great achievement, but not enough to become a legend. Frank wanted the Williams name to remain forever. And to do that, they had to become the best of the best. At that time, Lotus and Ferrari had 7 constructor titles each. So Frank's goal was obvious. The new season began with a serious problem. The ground effect that had brought Williams success was banned. Now the new rules required powerful engines. Frank understood how much more work he will need to put in order to get to the top. But he was torn by internal struggles. Virginia suffered another miscarriage, and the failures came together again in one terrible period. And of course, this was just the tip of the iceberg. The crisis deepened when the Arab sponsors announced that they would stop funding for the rest of the season. Everything had been on the upswing until recently, and now Frank was on the verge of collapse. His savior was named Honda, a Japanese engine supplier. Their first car was called the Williams FW09, which turned out to be incredibly unreliable. Although everyone in the team realized that they needed time to adapt.
It was a no-brainer for us. We did know we were going to go through quite a lot of pain, which we did in 1984, but it was really a no-brainer decision. But they approached us rather than the other way around. I knew we had to have a driver who had sat in front of a decent turbo engine, and the two that were on the list was Derek Warwick, who had been driving the Renault Turbo, and Nigel Mansell, who also with Lotus had driven the Renault Turbo engine. I do remember saying to Frank, "Come on, Frank, make a decision."
However, Frank was not in a hurry to make a choice. He decided to take a chance and invite a rookie to the team. Although he had no experience in Formula One, he was damn talented. He had already won Formula 3, and Frank arranged for him to do his first tests in the elite of motorsport. This newcomer's name was Ayrton Senna, but the deal didn't go through. Why? It remains a mystery. Another driver with a mustache, Nigel Mansell, joined the team. The results were not long in coming, with Keke Rosberg winning 2 times and Nigel 3. Together, the Williams team almost reached 3rd place in the Constructors' Championship. This season was very similar to 1979, when it became clear that the car had enormous potential. But for some reason, only one person did not believe it, Keke Rosberg, that left the team for their English competitor, McLaren. This made room for a 2-time champion, Nelson Piquet, who was considered the best driver at the time. He was convinced that the FW11 car created for the 1986 season would bring him another championship. Since the car's testing in France, everyone was convinced of victory. Everything seemed to be going perfectly, a powerful car and drivers eager to win. That was until March 8, 1986. Frank Williams hurried home after the tests to run a half marathon. Together with Peter Windsor, who was Williams' PR coordinator, they drove a rented Ford Sierra to the airport in Nice.
As we hit the back, that wall, the car hit the end and went up in the air. Just complete silence. I remember just thinking, what is going on? There's no noise now. And then massive impact. Really whack in my neck, sharp, pain.
The rounded pillars of the Sierra failed to withstand the impact, and the roof crashed in. Frank took the brunt of the impact, which went straight through the top of his head. Peter tried to pull him out by his armpits, but he was afraid to hurt him, so he supported his head and didn't pull his neck. At that time, Frank was screaming, "I'm never going to drive fast again. I'm going to drive a go-go-mobile." When the paramedics arrived, Frank was immediately transported to a hospital in Toulon. There, doctors said that the X-rays showed fatal injuries and that there was nothing they could do. Frank was rushed to Marseille and went through surgery. His wife Virginia also arrived to meet with the doctors. The surgeon who operated on Frank explained to Virginia that his vertebrae were torn and added at the end, "Vous avez compris." Confused, Ginny barely managed to say, "Est-il paralysé?" The doctor nodded. Tears rolled down her face. The doctor quietly suggested, "You can see him." Frank was lying motionless, and it was hard to recognize him. His face was bruised, cut, and horribly swollen. His body, which had been thin and fit yesterday, now looked terribly bloated. Suddenly, he asked Ginny, "Did they tell you I was paralyzed?" "Yes." As for me, I have lived 40 fantastic years of one life. Now I will have another 40 years of another life. At that moment, it became clear Frank would fight for his life. But no one could have imagined that there were even greater struggles waiting for him. The next day, Frank's condition had become even worse. He could hardly breathe and was freezing. Frank could only whisper, "Get me out of here. I'm cold. I can't breathe. Do anything." There was no doctor nearby. He was just left to suffer. Panicked, Ginny demanded an explanation from the chief doctor. Why wasn't Frank being helped? But she heard only cold words in response. "When will you take Frank back to England? It will be hard for us if Mr. Williams dies here. Are you saying that my husband is going to die?" "Oui, bien sûr." Virginia refused to believe it. After she said that, she immediately organized a plane to fly Frank to England. He was in critical condition, and this was the beginning of the darkest period of his life. Virginia described all of these events in detail in a book that Frank never dared to read in his entire life, but I did. In London hospitals, Frank underwent an urgent surgery, a tracheotomy. Everything went well, and he immediately began to breathe easily. But after that, the doctor told Ginny the news that she did not expect to hear in London.
He said to me, "Just how much more effort do you want us to make to keep your husband alive?" Sort of crossly. I think he thought that he should be left to die.
Ginny was shocked. Her mind flashed back to their first conversation with Frank. She knew he wanted to live. However, the horrors of the last few days mixed with reality. Maybe it was time to let him go without suffering. When the nurse took her out of the room, Ginny saw Peter Windsor.
And I asked Peter whether does he think we should let Frank die? But he said, "Ginny, no, Frank wants to live. He'll have to make major adjustments, but he has his children. There are trees, there is sunshine, he's a determined character, everybody loves him, he's very special. He won't want us to give up that easily."
Virginia finally realized that no one but her could save Frank's life, so she had to become his nurse. She learned how to clean his lungs so that he didn't feel pain, and how to insert a catheter to empty his urine. Ginny hardly slept, caring for Frank around the clock. From the very beginning, she lived in a hotel near the hospital to be always close by.
He clinically died 3 times.
His continued life was very much owed to Ginny, his wife, because she was with him much of the time, and very many of these times she would jump on top of him and literally pump his lungs out.
While Ginny was fighting for Frank's life, the championship began.
Await the start of the Brazilian Grand Prix and the 1986 season. Sadly, Frank Williams, boss of the Williams team, isn't here after a major road accident in France.
Everyone in the team wanted to win, to dedicate it to their boss.
Piquet wins in the Williams Honda. This one is for you, Frank.
I can say it was a very special day for me. I think it's a good present for Frank. I think he's there lying in bed, and I think he'll be happy to watch the race, and we hope God help Frank also.
Frank was in great physical shape, so he did the impossible. After only 5 months, he was released from the hospital and began the process of recovery. Soon, his patience with racing wore off, and he attended his home Grand Prix.
When Frank appeared in the wheelchair, the crowd just went crazy.
It's great fun to be with the team, it's great fun to be at a racetrack.
Nigel Mansell managed to win the race.
Nigel Mansell exits the last corner, crosses the line, and Mansell is the winner. Great stuff, wonderful drive.
And a heroic moment followed. On the podium,
There's Ginny Williams and Patrick Head, the designer of the winning Williams car, who has talked Nigel Mansell to victory, as well as Nigel Mansell driving, of course. Oh, what a day.
And what a wonderful present for Frank Williams in his fight to recovery from his road accident. He's always been a great British patriot, and there is Ginny holding up the trophy.
Virginia raised the victory trophy. Symbolizing the victory, her husband was alive. She saved his life, although Frank will forever be paralyzed from the head down. The man who ran half marathons every day would never walk again. He who loved driving fast would never drive again. New challenges awaited them that would change their lives 180 degrees. Although Frank was happy to be part of the team, there were serious problems within the team itself. Nelson and Nigel were in competition with each other, and as you know, competition between partners always ends badly. So in 1986, Williams won the Constructors' title, but missed out on winning the individual competition. The next season, Frank had a goal to attend every Grand Prix. He did an excellent job of it, as by the end of the season, Williams had won both championships for the first time since the Alan Jones era. But things were not as perfect as they seemed. After Frank's accident, Honda decided to stop providing engines. They didn't believe the team could survive. After all, how could a paralyzed man manage a team, right? So, for the 1988 season, Williams was without its winning engine. But he also had to deal with problems back at home. Ginny believed that after Frank was released from the hospital, everything would return to normal. However, 2 years later, reality finally crushed her dreams. Frank would remain paralyzed forever. He had become a completely new person. The hardest thing for Ginny was to adapt to her new life with her husband. Everything was upside down. Now she was in charge of both the family and Frank himself. The only thing he could control was planning and his mind. Obsessed with punctuality, Frank demanded that everything happen exactly as scheduled. The slightest delay and you could expect an explosion. Ginny missed the little things. His laugh, which would never happen because of the damaged muscles. Even the familiar smell had disappeared because the medication had changed it. Everything she loved about Frank seemed to be destroyed. She became a mere caregiver in her own home, which became like a dormitory filled with people who cared for him. One day, she lost her patience. "I'm sorry, but I want to leave. It's not your fault, I just want my life back." Frank didn't show any emotion, just looked at her. "How do you feel about this, Frank?" "Ginny, if this is what you want to do, then do it." Virginia felt like a nurse who had just been fired. All Frank cared about was who would take care of him now. After 13 years of marriage, they decided to separate. So a new chapter began for Frank. He was focused exclusively on Formula One. Frank knew exactly what he needed for another triumph. His team was no longer an outsider. Williams had become one of the best. Therefore, it was time for new talents to give the team a fresh start. One of them was Adrian Newey, who had a PhD in aerodynamics. In addition, the team was introducing a revolutionary active suspension under the leadership of Paddy Lowe. All this with the new Renault engine, which made a comeback to Formula One.
I don't think I could take credit for persuading an enormous company like Renault to come into Formula One. They made that decision. The trick was to get them to come our way. And in fact, I remember them turning up here, I think, out of the blue, somewhere a bit out of the blue. A very nice gentleman called Kaza. We began to talk about it, and it worked out brilliantly for us.
There was only one thing missing, a talented driver who could beat everyone. Frank kept an eye on Ayrton Senna after the first tests. He even offered him to become the #1 driver, but the Brazilian magician refused. Since then, it has been Frank's dream to see Senna join Williams. Although it didn't seem like such a big deal, it took the team several years to adapt the car to the new technology. In 1992, the car became so dominant that Nigel Mansell set a new record by winning the championship in 11 races. Williams was out of reach of competitors. The following season, three-time champion Alain Prost joined the team and they continued to dominate. Another double in the championship. Everything was going so well that Frank's dream finally came true once again. Ayrton Senna signed a contract with Williams for the 1994 season. This was not the only positive news. Relationships with Virginia seemed to have settled down. While all the F1 success was going, Frank and Ginny found a way to live with Frank's condition. They never divorced, but their relationship was changed forever, and maybe for the best. The season started with Senna receiving the championship car. As the main favorite, he won the pole at his home Grand Prix in Brazil, which only strengthened his belief in his victory. However, the first two races were a nightmare, as Senna failed to finish even once. The new FIA rules made it difficult to drive the Williams FW16, as they banned all electronic assistance for pilots. Ahead was the race in San Marino, which changed Formula One forever. On Saturday, during qualifying, Roland Ratzenberger lost control and crashed into a concrete wall, killing him immediately. On Sunday, the race begins with a massive accident. On the 7th lap, suddenly, Ayrton Senna was tragically killed in an accident. never scoring a single point for Williams. Frank again lost the driver he loved. Was it the driver's mistake? Or was it a problem with the car? Why did this accident happen? The Italian justice system has been trying to find answers for 13 years. You can watch the details of the investigation in my video about this tragedy. The 1994 season was a very controversial one. Although Williams won the Constructors' Cup, no one could be happy about it. Over the next year, the team could not move on from the tragedy. But in 1996, Newey displayed his skills to the whole world.
David Hill exits the chicane and wins the Japanese Grand Prix. And I've got to stop because I've got a lump in my throat.
On the wave of success in '97.
Oh, yes. No. Out. I don't think. Out goes Michael Schumacher. That didn't work. Get out. Now, this is a replay of the World Championship in 1994. Hakkinen is going to win the European Grand Prix. David Coulthard goes second. And Jacques Villeneuve second settles for third place and the World Championship of 1997.
At that moment, the Williams team became the most successful in Formula One. Frank, who started with Piers Courage, who was the biggest loser in Formula One, who lost his team and eventually became paralyzed, was finally number one. Although the team won the title, this triumph hid a terrible truth. Adrian Newey left Williams due to conflicts, and the ghost of Imola '94 continued to haunt Williams. Patrick Head even asked Newey to take responsibility for the tragedy. As a result, '97 was the last title for Williams. The departure of key talent, the loss of Renault support, and new Concord agreements all began to destroy Frank's empire. The team's last victory came in 2012, and it was the last triumph. In the same year, Patrick Head left the team, which put an end to the legendary partnership between the two friends, who conquered Formula One together. But this was not the only shock for Frank. A year later, Virginia Williams, the woman without whom Williams would not exist, died. This shock was too heavy for Frank. He even stopped seeing the sense of returning home.
I kept down the corridors for most nights of the week.
Down the corridor in the factory?
Yeah. She didn't fall apart. She took very good care of me. It must have been very hard for her. Suddenly not to have a proper husband anymore, and they have to spend our time looking after him.
In 2020, the team was bought out by an investment fund. And a year later, Frank Williams, a legend who devoted his entire life to Formula One, died. Although in a few years the Ferrari and Schumacher era broke all possible records, the Williams team remained the second best team in the history of Formula One. Frank had a clear vision. What about the other teams? Eddie Jordan's team eventually became Aston Martin. Ken Tyrrell, his team turned into Honda, then Brawn, and now Mercedes. Wait, did you hear the story of Brawn, which was bought for just £1? The team did the impossible. They never lost a world championship. Click on the video to find out how the underdogs changed Formula One forever.